All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope everyone enjoyed their lunch. As Bryce mentioned, my name's Kevin Clauson. I'm an associate professor at the Lipscomb University College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. And for about the last 15 years or so, I've been focused on digital health. And so about 2.5 years ago, some of our students and faculty started exploring where blockchain intersects with digital health. And so it is my pleasure to moderate this session, and I'm going to have each of our panelists go ahead and start with a very brief introduction of themselves as well as their roles.
Thank you. My name is Disa Choun. I have over 10 years of experience in the pharma and biotech industry. I currently work for UCB. UCB is a biopharma company focusing in creating value for patients with immunology and neurology conditions. In my current role, I'm the director head of data acquisitions. My responsibility involves in acquiring data in clinical and operational data, medical coding, and applications that supports around these processes. Prior to joining the pharma industry, I was a co-founder for an IT startup company.
Hi everyone, I'm Joe Kim. I work for Eli Lilly and Company in a department called Clinical Innovation. And our job is pretty simple, which is to accelerate the pace of research. The rate limiting step right now is all about enrollment, and that's our #1 problem. There's a lot of different ways we can tackle that, so I think we're up here to talk about blockchain and see how that may or may not help us out. I've been in the pharma industry for about 17 years, I think. I've done 2 tours of duty at Merck, and I recently came from Shire, so I've seen the industry from a number of angles. It's great to be here.
Cool. So I'm Maria Palombini with the IEEE Standards Association, and acronym for IEEE is the Institute for Electronic and Electrical Engineers. We are a nonprofit association in the area of electrical engineering and engineering. Most of my work right now is predicated on my history of working in the pharma industry and research, and what we're looking at is blockchain applications in pharmaceutical framework in the areas of clinical trials, the pharmaceutical supply chain, obviously in the area of the health record and blockchain and IoT and all that good stuff. And what we're here to do is really to talk about the application and see where it works, and ultimately our goal is to develop standards to advance the adoption of the technology.
Fantastic, thank you. So I went through and asked several people over the last couple of days, attendees at the conference, what clinical research means to them and how they sort of would operationally define it. And I got a lot of different answers. So I thought maybe we'd start with, just for the purposes of this conversation, maybe Maria, from the IEEE's perspective, how do you guys kind of operationally define clinical research?
So we currently have an incubator program in which Kevin is a part of, that we're looking at the idea of clinical trials and blockchain and hopefully putting a consensus towards a framework for standards. And when we're looking at clinical research, we're looking at the point of clinical trials. So, when we're looking at the exploration of medicine and the development, going through phase 1 through phase 4, and then post-approval kind of area. That's where we're focused right now. Not to say that the other areas are not important, but that's where our focus is.
Great. So Joe's already alluded to one of them, I think, but I thought it'd be interesting next to kind of try to identify within clinical research, what are the 1 or 2 challenges or pain points in conducting and executing and planning and disseminating clinical research? And maybe Disa, we could start with you.
Yeah, sure. I agree with Joe. I mean, clearly, recruitment is an issue, and retention, patient retention. And for me as well is the data quality integrity across the clinical trials.
Okay. And Joe?
Yes, we should probably think about clinical research in a slightly different way, because when you talk to patients and you ask them about their experience, they position clinical research in their mind as a healthcare service, right? Because they have to be sick. And I'm talking about interventional drug trials, because they have to be sick and they're either not doing well on their medicine, or they have side effects, or they can't afford it. Something's changed and they still need to look for treatment. So if you think about clinical research as a service offering, essentially what we're trying to do is create locations where this service can be offered that is looking for the right patient type who's eligible for that service. And it's promoting it in the right way, responsibly, so that patients know about it, allowing them to access it, and then making it sort of accessible in general. So right now, clinical research is delivered in a brick and mortar banking model, and that has a lot of constraints to it, because if you're only open Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, well, guess what? A lot of people can't participate. And if it requires you to come in all the time, where you can't do anything from home or through retail health or your local care, well, guess what? A lot of people can't do that. And then sort of the end experience is important too, because then when the patients finish research, they go back to healthcare to some degree, but do you give them a receipt, right? How do you help them transition back into it? So if you think about research as its own little but pop-up healthcare service, that's probably a good way to think about it for generalist technologists and other folks who aren't like steeped into the clinical research enterprise.
That's great. Maria, any other pain points or challenges?
So when we talk to people in the pharmaceutical industry, such as Joe, we hear like there's like 10 different barriers in clinical trials, and mostly when we get down to it, I find two real basic areas, and it's managing the competing needs between patient privacy and data sharing. And then this operating on pretty much these existing legacy systems that are not really geared up for what we call the data sharing economy. And so it manifests itself in areas where we say, wow, the cost of clinical trials is going up. The length of time of clinical trials is going up. The inability to connect clinical research with medical research. It kind of sort of boils down to this fundamental problem in which we're going to talk about today, where we think blockchain could work, but it's really trying to manage those two needs and having the platform satisfy both needs to enable knocking down some of the barriers we see right now in clinical trials.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that...
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to add, I mean, I think it's, the way I see blockchain is that it could also help to speed up new drug development. Absolutely. Because I think, trying to resolve the issue of recruitment in a way that, we know in the industry, it's roughly like 30% of the time spent on recruiting patients. Yep. And in clinical trials. And, approximately 20% of sites never recruit.
Nope.
And, if you add up all these time frames that it takes to recruit patients, I mean, my hope is that through blockchain, we can speed up that recruitment, find the right patients, and be able to deliver the drugs quicker to the market to close that gap of unmet needs. And I think that's very important because we're all patients. Mm-hmm.
So this is where I'm a non-believer, right? So I don't believe blockchain has a role in the role of recruitment, right? I think there's some things you could use to enable that. But I've come here because I want to believe, right? That's why I'm here, so convert me, please.
We're going to convert you, maybe.
You tried last night.
I tried.
So I think that's a really good segue, right, to that next question, and really what's at the source of what this conversation could be about, which is, I'm hearing speed, recruitment, retention, awareness, accessibility, data integrity, data privacy. So for those of you who do, where do you see blockchain helping address some of those problems within clinical research?
Well, from my perspective, one, using EMR, EHR data. I mean, we've seen the example of what Estonia has done. I mean, their EMR data is already in blockchain. Having that standardization and also, be able to use that data that's already verified in a standard way in the clinical trial is quicker for us to gather that information and put it already in our case report forms that's needed to conduct the trial. And for me, that's the key element. It's also bringing or analyzing beforehand which of these patients can be included. So it's a quicker way of, finding the right patients as well, and also, reducing the screen failure rate that we see in across the clinical trials. Have I convinced you, Joe?
No. Actually, about 10 years ago, there was this. This movement to use EHR and analyze it and find the right patient at the right time during the point of care, and the physician would be pinged, hey, your patient might be eligible. So while that's technically easy to do, nobody did it. Meaning the alert would come up and the physician was like, yeah, I'm not doing that. Because what you end up with is this problem of, hey, if you're my patient, research will come up. Disa might be a match for this trial, but I don't know this trial from a can of paint. Like, so why would I hook Disa up with this trial that I don't really know, right? I don't know enough about it. Mm-hmm. And by the way, there's all these other trials out there that might be fit for you too. So if you look on ct.gov right now, clinicaltrials.gov, there's like 1,300 lung cancer trials actively enrolling. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're treating a patient with lung cancer, like, how do you navigate all that stuff in a way where you say, yes, Disa, this is a good one for you, right? So technically, yes, you can do it. But to get that physician on board to say, like, all right, I'll enroll you or I'll refer you, that's where it gets funny.
The idea behind, I mean, it's not just blockchain, but we need to empower the patients as well. So for me, it's, if the patient owns their data and they say, okay, well, I would like to participate in a clinical trial because I have this disease that I cannot be treated in the current drugs that are out there in the market. So if this patient already consents through blockchain and already agrees to say, okay, I'm going to share this element or this set of data, then if we have a site or physician who is recruiting and they have access to that, they can just easily, hopefully, in the future, click on a button and just, be able to recruit a patient. So that's my kind of vision in some ways.
So when we think of blockchain at IEEE, we don't think of it in isolation, right? Just as this one technology. There's IoT, there's AI, there's machine learning, there's whatever's next. And all of these technologies converging on blockchain enable us to start parsing apart the challenges that we have. So in some of our industry connections programs, we have different people talking about the concept of health wearable data, if it was standardized, writing to a blockchain. And that becomes another sea of people where you have data that you can cherry pick for your clinical trial, right? So here we are using technology. But there are some fundamental areas that technology can't fix. And you alluded to that, where the fear of the patients to participate in a trial. So we can have all the technology and people can consent to be queried, but doesn't mean they're going to agree to do the trial. So we have to look at technology and protocols and process and human behavior and emotional IQ. All these things have to come together as an educational awareness program when we're talking to patients about it. But the way the state of things work today, there are so many people who are excluded from trials because just of the nature of the process that's currently around them. And so a perfect example, the American Cancer Society posted this, is only 5% of cancer patients over the age of 60 are recruited for trials. Now, we all know that cancer is growing, unfortunately, at an alarming rate, and the representative sample is far too less. And it's really just a lot of it is people don't have access to digital health, not able to enroll in patient registries, they don't even know their own data. Some of them are taking, unfortunately, counterfeit drugs because they're buying stuff off the internet. I mean, there is a lot of things going on, and this is part of some of the initiatives we have at IEEE, sort of from a technology point of view, try to address some of these factors.
Another way to look at it is with the customer type, let's call it. So patients in research only come from two places. Either the investigator knows them, mm-hmm. or they don't. So for the patient that the investigator knows because they've either treated them before or they were previous trial participants, that's easy. I know how to find them if I'm the investigator. What's hard is finding the patient that the investigator doesn't know. And oftentimes, because general healthcare practitioners are irrelevant to the conversation for good and bad reasons, patients will find their way to the clinic by themselves through media, mm-hmm. right, through the internet, through paid search, right? That works pretty well. And if there's a way to amplify the amount of patients that the investigator doesn't know to connect them to research, right. that's gonna really help. Because right now, we are only going as fast as we're going because we mostly rely on the patients that the investigator does know. Right.
Mm-hmm. Right, which is the challenge, right? Because and even most trials, the patients are recruited within a geographic circumference where the investigator is located, yeah. right? So there's right there, let's call it a biased sample. So you take out environmental factors, you take out everything that goes along with it. But at the same time, like you were saying, when you go into this mass market of trying to recruit people, you're not working with health data. Mm-hmm. So you're sort of like, oh, everybody, like you don't know much about them. Once that data's on a blockchain, you already know certain, genetic data or, symptom data, whatever predisposition to it, you're sort of querying qualified data, which naturally cuts down your time because now you got to evaluate and, you say, okay, well, and it's verified, right? On the blockchain, it's an immutable record. So it hasn't been fudged with unless the person who put it there is a liar. But, that's human behavior. So I think there are definitely opportunities for it, but I think it does come with a massive education awareness program.
Yeah.
So yesterday, I think I heard someone describe blockchain as B2b Middleware is the way they thought about it, right? And so recognizing the purposeful oversimplification of it, if you think of another type of middleware like Apple Research Kit or Care Kit, et cetera, and you go back to your points about wearables, IoT, difficulty in identifying recruiting, something like this, right? So this is a motive ring, right? This is the new form function for Fitbits, Misfits, et cetera.
Right.
Everything it does, activity, sleep, heart rate, et cetera, is in this form factor now. So if you look at the ability of that type of middleware to create a stronger way, a more robust way to share data, to open up those streams, is that then possible to use that type of stream to access patient data, potential clinical research participants that wasn't available previously? And if not, why not?
I would say potentially yes, but first of all, we need to have the consent of patients. So I think that's very important. I mean, we in this industry, I mean, we're highly regulated, so everything has to be consented. We can definitely do some predictive analytics around that, potentially. But contacting the patient itself definitely is not allowed. And I would say, maybe in the future where with predictive analytics, we can identify, okay, which are the areas or demographic regions where we say, okay, there's more prevalence of this type of conditions that maybe this is where we're going to start, contacting all these different physicians and, trying to recruit patients in that way. Of course, there's other means. In the US, you're able to advertise quite a lot in the media. But yeah, it's still a struggle. I think even with blockchain, in some ways it could help in terms of getting the information right away for those patients that already consented. So that's, I think, the positive side of it. In terms of, reaching out to patients that are remotely, I mean, there's other ways of doing it. There's virtual clinical trials that can be done. The investigator or the physician can be based somewhere remotely and could be recruiting, for example, patients in the Bahamas or somewhere. So it doesn't matter where, but that is already happening now. But imagine using this virtual clinical trial and then blockchain. I mean, I think the recruitment period will be shorter, and then we can speed up the process of delivering the drug maybe 3 to 5 years earlier. Then the patients don't have to wait that long.
So could you speak just a moment, excuse me, as well, about the differences in terms of more or less restrictive in the UK, where you're based, versus the US in and around clinical trial research?
Data privacy, for sure. I think in Europe it's more regulated, I would say, or no, well, maybe that's not the right word, but it's more restrictive in that sense. I mean, even just having the data of even a healthcare practitioner in a system, you need their consent. In some countries, they really need to sign a consent. So, that's also a hurdle that we need to work together as an industry, I mean, in unison, because it's not just the pharmas trying to, develop these drugs, but we need to also collaborate with the regulators and also the health authorities to see, okay, what is the best way that we can use the data, of course, in the right way for the purpose that we need to, ethically. And I think, between US and Europe, I think that, I'm not a legal expert, but, data privacy is it's a big issue, I would say, or a big constraint.
In Europe, it's the GDPR right now, really the driving force. What's going to be for data privacy and managing data and how that's all going to work. But with regards to your question about the IoT device, and The challenge that we have on the wearable side is every day there's I'm gonna say one, there's like thousands of new clinical wearables coming out, and a lot of the way it's written right now is like, if you look at your Fitbit owns your data today, the way it works. When you sign that agreement form in those 75 pages, it's in there that they own your data, and they don't license out that data, right? They don't give that data out for clinical research. And I think it's just because they figure it's IP and it's proprietary and that kind of thing. Now, and I think in Europe that probably wouldn't fly so well because it's your health data with GDPR, but the way it stands today. But if wearables, if the whole concept of wearables turned around and became a true clinical research tool, right? Not just for when we're looking at the development of medicine, but also when you look at like screening for DNA and genetics and all that other good stuff. And you really had it written where the data can be used in such a way that can be, on a blockchain with consent, like the person writes consent, yes, I want to be queried, and then once you get into a trial, you sign whatever the sponsor's consent and whatever it has to be, and all done and highly, PC, right? I think there's just a lot of opportunity, but the challenge that we're having with wearables, it's sort of like a little bit of an unregulated market in the sense, not unregulated, but more, it's not standardized, like the data ontologies, and that's the same challenge we see in electronic health records, right? It's data standards, or lack of, or like you can't really just dump that data, health record data anywhere. It has to be all unified and mapped and standardized, and so that's part of the challenge, but I believe the clinical wearable is a tremendous opportunity for patient recruitment, and especially with what's coming out as far as IoT devices. I mean, if we can get a handle on that.
Tell me more about how it's a thing for recruitment, though. I'm going to challenge you on that.
I love that about you. So here's a perfect example, right? Let's say you have all the data on your Fitbit, right? Tracking your heart rate, that kind of thing, gets written to a blockchain, right? But they don't know it's you. It's still de-identified. They don't know it's Joe. You're just 1, 2, 3, right? And let's say they're looking for certain trends in the data that's all sitting on the blockchain. They can pretty much go in and query it. Right now, if they call Fitbit's going to be like, no, I'm not giving you my 1 million consumers' data. I'm not going to give it to you. They're going to say we're not licensed to do that and whatever it is. But if I've given the consent when I signed Fitbit, I'm just using Fitbit as an example. Apple Watch, whatever you want to use is okay with me. But you sign your consent, you say, yeah, I want to be part of a blockchain where my data can be queried, just queried at this point. Right? You go in, you're doing a trial on cardiac test, you go in and query, and boom, now you have access to 1 million people and their data that you never had before.
I see what
you
you're saying.
pay for it. So I mean, probably in some way. We're not talking about who pays for this yet, but you have.
Well, what has to happen first is that wearable needs to be validated to be capturing something that regulators and scientists believe, right? Because I could create Uncle Joe's
the standard
fitness tracker,
correct?
Right, and so no one cares unless it's been validated.
That's what I'm back to, like wearables or
that has to be done first.
Have to be standardized. Now, there's a lot going on in the FDA and digital health and looking at all this stuff and mobile apps and that kind of thing. But that's when we talk about a standard. That's exactly what we're looking at.
Well, not just standard. It has to be validated as a clinical measure.
Correct.
Right?
That's got to include regulatory.
Yeah.
Right.
And
and then it always
seems like these startups, they don't want to do the work to do that. They're like, oh, I got something really hot and flashy. Well, is it measuring what it says it's supposed to be measuring? Will the FDA believe it?
Yeah.
And if those answers are no and no, then go back to the drawing board.
And that's the challenge, right? When you look at even today, in blockchain world, people are talking about blockchain can do this, and there's still a lot of hype around it, and unfortunately that's the bad part about it, because there's a lot of good there, but everybody's getting attracted to the shiny diamond around it. It's going to do all this, but there's a lot of stuff on there that still needs to be proven, and I think it will be, but that's going to be the proof in the pudding.
There were some things last night I started to convince myself of. Especially when you talked about virtual trials. Right. So this is one key element of having us be able to enroll faster. If we can make the experience such that you don't have to take off 2 hours every Monday for 3 months to participate in research, and instead you can participate with a combination of virtual wearables, home health, and maybe your local care, well then that's great. That's actually, it creates a much more friendly experience for patients, and then it should open up the ability for them to enroll. Now this is where blockchain could help, because that's not going to scale easily if you can't manage what everyone's doing for each patient. Right. So here's a very simple use case. There's a form called the 1572, and when you do research, the investigator's listed on there and his or her staff, and it's usually 4 or 5 names. And it doesn't change much, and when it does change, you basically fill out a new one and have the new name on there. If you start doing this virtual trial where every patient has their own little cluster of care teams, right, all doing the bits of clinical research, well, and all under a single investigator, so that 1572 looks very different.
Right.
And managing that and making sure you keep track of who's coming and who's going and who's doing what becomes a real nightmare if this model scales. Now, it hasn't scaled yet, so it hasn't been a problem. That's something on the horizon where I can see blockchain really helping.
Yeah.
Yeah, and validating that data and the data is being immutable
Yeah.
also lets you know that the data
Right.
source wasn't tampered with,
Yeah.
which is critical.
Well, not only that. So if a physician is part of this set of activities for that patient, right? But then maybe it's somebody else. Like, not only is it immutable, but it's temporally aligned with the activities that were done. That's really important.
Do any of you see utility from a blockchain perspective in terms of helping with requiring report outs to federal agencies in around research and making limited data sets available with some of those requirements that are now being instituted or that have been instituted for a period of time?
How come you're not answering this one? How come you're not answering
I'm the
this
skeptic.
one?
Oh, you. I'm the skeptic. Can you say the question differently, maybe?
Sure. So in thinking about some of the reporting that pharmaceutical companies have to do back to the FDA, to federal agencies in and around clinical research, trial data, et cetera, making data sets available, limited data sets, do you think that going back to Maria's comment about it being immutable and it having elevated degree of integrity around it would help with that transparency perspective when reporting back out
Yes.
the required?
Yes, I completely agree because, if we're using, my vision is if we're all using blockchain in the future, hopefully in 10 years' time or so, and, we have this private blockchain where we're doing all these clinical trials, we have all these sites, and it's real-time data, right? So they're collecting information real-time. The authorities will also be part of this blockchain where they can also see the information. And I think, it will speed up even the process for them to do or approving some of these drugs. I think it would definitely help in the future.
So along those lines, some of the oversight boards that would be internally tracking in real time to make sure there's not adverse events or something that would require altering, how might that impact both that process and external confidence that those types of things are being done? Could that speak to a speed function as well?
I mean, something like a safety letter distribution that goes out to all the investigators when a new safety, that is a bit of an inefficient process, right? So basically, a new safety finding happens and you have to let all the investigators know that this is a thing, and it may or may not affect the consent form. And so making sure everyone's opened it and done their thing can be a bit of a hassle. We're not talking thousands of investigators, but it can be hard to keep track of. I can see an application there, but I don't know if it's going to improve speed.
I think it would. I have to disagree with you because within clinical trials, there's the investigators are obliged to report any adverse events within a very tight time frame. And once the company receives that information, we assess that, yes, it's a serious adverse event. We need to distribute the information within a week, for example. So if we have blockchain, all that data comes very quickly, timely, could be assessed by the medical staff in the pharma companies, and then it can be distributed, again, automatically. So I think blockchain could be, resolve some of these problems that we see on the data delay elements. In general, data delay or quality or integrity of the data, because the whole point of blockchain is that it's also validated in some ways and immutable, and there's a full audit trail. And so I think that's
all helpful, but no one sits around tapping their foot waiting for the A's to be processed. Everyone sits around tapping their foot waiting for enrollment to happen. So that's what I mean, that's the number one priority.
That's the driving force. The driving force is the patient engagement, right? Because we know, I mean, numbers vary, but like 1/3 of the money in a clinical trial goes to patient recruitment and patient retention. That's what different studies say, so I'm just going to quote some of the studies. But at the end of the day, but there is the hangover effect of blockchain, right? So we can use it as the main reason. The marketability of it is patient engagement and patient recruitment, but then it's going to have this whole integrity effect, the data, the connecting back to the medical side, the bedside aspect of it. And so the point of the matter is, it's like, it is a full package, right? And the one thing that we're noticing in blockchain across multiple industries is how you market it, right? How you message it. Because at first, there's the hype, and I was just talking about this before, true visibility, right? Pharma doesn't love true visibility, because what does that mean? Is my IP going to be visible? How much can the regulators see? How much can the patient see? And it's like, no, there's transparency with certain levers of control. You can control how much is transparency, and you have all these controls in there. But I think it's all about messaging. And if the message is that you can reduce the time of trials, you can cut the cost of trials, you can speed drug development and advance innovation, those are the true, that's really the outputs from blockchain. And then the secondary effect is all the other things that come in from the data integrity, racing on adverse effects, whatever, safety, letters, warnings, that kind of stuff. But that's got to be the key message for the non-believers.
So where then would you stand on that sort of virtual versus thinking of the classic interventional drug type of trial in terms of time frame? So if you think about that virtual first, there's been a lot of conversations, I think, about low-hanging fruit, understandably. And if that is at least the lower-hanging fruit, if not the low-hanging fruit, what's your most optimistic time frame on when you might see something be put into production, something be used in that sort of lower-hanging fruit of virtual clinical trials or virtual trials?
Well, some of these distributed virtual trials are happening already.
Right.
So it's happening, and these are trials that are under an IND, interventional drug trials. So they haven't scaled, and as they do scale, as I mentioned, there are some problems that blockchain could help with. But it would be the tail wagging the dog a little bit to say that blockchain's leading the scaling. It's going to be necessary to make it work, I think. I'll put it slightly differently. If the three largest health systems in the US or the world, whatever, decided to have all electronic health records on blockchain and where patients could manage where they go, that would help me. But that's not something that a pharma company that's definitely the tail wagging the dog. Like, you can't get the Pfizers of the world to hey, Mayo Clinic, you should, right? There's a larger context there that has to influence whether or not that happens. And if it does happen, well, great, yes. There's value there for us, and there should be commensurate rewards to that system.
I think you might be in the right place. I might need confirmation, but I think 2 out of the 3 biggest health systems in America are headquartered in Nashville. So if you want to extend your stay, and
I brought my checkbook.
From Disa, you want to comment on sort of optimistic time frame where you would see that put into effect, and maybe speak to some of the efforts that you've made at UCB as well?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so for virtual trials, I agree. I mean, it's already happening, so it hasn't scaled up. Yes, different companies are piloting right now, so it remains to see, okay, whether this will help us in that sense. In terms of blockchain, for me, my hope is that within 10 years, I mean, right now I basically started a group of enthusiasts of blockchain and pharma, and we are basically writing a white paper to Refuse. I mean, it's a non-profit organization. The intention is, one, to educate, because one thing you were saying that, blockchain, people just think, oh, this is the solution and that's it. But it's a technical solution to a problem, but we still need to have processes around it to make sure that it works. Because a lot of times we hear all this hype about technology and everyone says, oh yeah, let's do it. Then you come up with the business case and you realize, okay, this doesn't work, or the ROI is not good enough, and it's because you don't have a solution, a low-hanging fruit that could resolve it. So I think the first element that we're doing is educating the pharma what exactly is blockchain and how we can use blockchain in our clinical trials or supply chain. Like early on, there was a discussion around that. And hopefully, in the future, it's be able to, have all the data in a standard way, like using EMR, EHR. So what we're doing with this group is also coming up with detailed use cases for specific problems and be able to use or have these use cases to be converted to pilots. So also looking into the perspective of blockchain technology, is this feasible? Because not everything maybe could be used or resolved with blockchain, but there's definitely some key elements that yes, we can. And I think recruitment, yes, I do believe that yes, we can, blockchain can help in some ways. So that's one of the activities that I'm doing right now, and hopefully, next year we'll be presenting around this, and the next step will be really doing a proof of concept with all these individuals from the different pharma companies.
So as far as blockchain specifically, I do have a colleague of mine who works on virtual reality in medicine, and he's doing some awesome work at the University of Stanford. But as blockchain as it goes, I think one of the things that we need to have before we really start talking about when it's going to be full is the ability for people to know that it's okay to talk about failures, right? This is the one thing. Everybody's like either not talking about what they're doing because they want first mover advantage and whatever else is going on, but they're also afraid about talking about failures. And when you talk about an emerging technology, you have to talk about the failure so you can learn from it. I mean, even in drug innovation, you put a drug, it fails a trial, you go back and you do it again. I mean, and blockchain is no different. And so I think it's really important for the industry to acknowledge that, regardless what industry we're in. And this is something that we try to do at the IEEE with our incubator programs, these test beds. Being a nonprofit, we don't have any sort of competition, right? The whole idea is for everybody to come in and say, hey, let's try simulation model with synthetic data, let's see how it works. And then we can see what fails and what works, and then try to take it to the next step. And I think that's really critical. We can come out and say in 5 years, we're going to have blockchain ready to go, full implementation across the entire pharmaceutical framework. And I can tell you right now that I don't think that's going to happen. But I think that we really need to start seriously looking at test beds and being able to acknowledge failures and learning from them so that we can make sure it's done right.
I think that's a crucial point. And one of the things that I took away from Charlie Martin's keynote, in a sense, is healthcare is the most disruption-proof industry
Right.
in the world. And so those are definitely challenges in and around that. We have a few minutes left. We've got a question here, Milt, I think.
Sure. So Kevin, as I mentioned, is part of our, we have industry connections programs which are open and inclusive, meaning you don't have to be a member of our organization to participate in them. But we do, so we have one that's specifically looking at 4 work streams, which is blockchain in the pharmaceutical supply chain, blockchain in clinical trials, blockchain in medical device supply chain, and we have one on blockchain in food safety. Sort of, let's throw that in there. But the idea is that we have a consensus and a cross-matrix group. So we have people from academia, from corporate, and from tech. And they sort of come in and start this baseline discussion of the barriers, right? We've been talking about, and a lot of the barriers we're talking about are about process and protocol rather than technology right now. Sort of like, big question, who owns the data? Who's going to pay for it? What happens when people start appending to it? So we go through these series of conversations. And ultimately, within 12 months to 18 months, we start working through it and start writing what we call recommendations for frameworks, in which that recommendation then goes to what we call a working group who starts evaluating it. But it's really critical in our working groups that we have that cross matrix of representation. It shouldn't be the technologists driving the standard, and it shouldn't be corporate, it shouldn't be academia, and regulators can be part of it, working together to make that consensus framework. Agriculture, food safety.
Which is health, too.
It's health. Well, it's, you know, for IEEE, we're all about advancing technology for humanity. So the idea of patient safety, consumer safety, patient care, if technology can make an impact in those critical areas, working together with, you know, entities and academia and regulators, then that's where we want to be.
Hi, this is for Joseph. My name is Miriam Paramore. I'm president of OptimizeRx. Our company is a digital communication mechanism from pharma to the EMR in workflow. So my question is about your comment about the alerts for doctors that, hey, this, you know, Miriam is eligible for a trial, was not effective. My question is, are there any initiatives where you're messaging the provider through the EMR to educate them about trials that are relevant to their specialty area, to create that awareness? You know, what they spend an average of 4 hours a day in their EMR. Is that something that you're considering? And if not, what are the other digital messaging mechanisms that you're using to increase provider awareness of what trials might be relevant to them and their patients?
Yeah, so great question. If you look in the literature, any time this has been examined, the idea of physician referrals, it's always been either null or like very little. And I'll try and summarize it succinctly. It all comes down to a few key characteristics, themes that always crop up. One is that there's just this general weird mistrust of clinical research, which is ironic because physicians will prescribe drugs based on research, but they won't trust the research. Anyway, so there's that. There's just this lack of not knowing enough about any given study, so that's a good reason. They're also not skilled up on talking to patients about research participation, especially if they're not the investigator. So there are these common themes that come up. So I think, to your point, there needs to be a multi-pronged approach to reduce that anxiety or that mistrust in the research enterprise in general. But then there's a whole skill set around how do you help a physician have a good conversation with a patient about treatment A, treatment B, and clinical research, right? Using a shared decision-making model, something like that. So there's lots of little projects in the industry sort of trying to address that. There is one small company who's trying to attack it from a slightly different problem, where they opt in physicians who want to do this, but just don't have the time, and then they'll sort of surface up trial opportunities for their patients, matching on the EHR, and then there's a workflow and a fair market value compensation component in this platform. I can tell you who it is later, but you know, they've been working on it for a number of years. There wasn't critical mass. Maybe they're getting to it now that can provide meaningful numbers of patients.
So one last question. All right. If not, I want to thank you for your time and attention, and if you'll please join me in thanking the panelists as well.